Welcome to this special edition of our series dedicated to the great minds of political and economic thought. Today, we offer you an exceptional format, an immersive journey into the bubbling France of the 19th century, to meet two giants of liberal thought, Alexis de Tocqueville and Frédéric Bastiat. Although one was a Norman aristocrat fascinated by the workings of political democracy, and the other a bourgeois from the lands who became a master in the art of dissecting economic illusions, both shared the same fight, the same benches at the National Assembly in 1848, and the same fears in the face of rising statism.
Even more fascinating, they share an unsettling posthumous destiny, adulated and studied in the Anglo-Saxon world. They both suffered a long and unjust oblivion in their own country before finally being rediscovered. In this major episode, we will cross their visionary perspectives. We will begin by exploring the relentless logic and biting irony of Frédéric Bastiat, before delving into the prophetic mind of Alexis de Tocqueville. But before we travel back in time, let us ask ourselves, why do these two men matter so intensely today? Look around us. We live in an era where citizens increasingly demand that the state guarantee their happiness, their jobs, and their financial security. We live in societies burdened by massive public debts, where the government is expected to be the ultimate provider, a benevolent parent shielding us from every risk. This exact scenario, the transformation of the state from a protector of basic rights into a sprawling, omnipotent machine, is precisely what Tocqueville and Bastiat saw forming on the horizon over a century and a half ago. They warned us that when a nation surrenders its individual responsibilities to the state, it slowly trades its liberty for a comfortable illusion. They saw the early seeds of the modern welfare state and sounded the alarm. By understanding their lives today, we are not just reading history, we are holding up a mirror to our own 21st century democracies. The state is the great fiction by which everyone endeavors to live at the expense of everyone else. You may have already heard this striking quote, but do you know the man who wrote it? Today, we are going to dive into the life and thought of a fascinating author, a Frenchman idolized in the United States, quoted by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, considered by the great historian of economics Joseph Schumpeter as the most brilliant economic journalist who ever lived. And yet, almost totally forgotten in his own country. This man is Frédéric Bastiat. In just 6 years of public activity, he revolutionized the way we talk about economics, wielding satire, humor, and implacable logic to destroy preconceived ideas, protectionism, and nascent socialism. In this episode, we will explore his romantic biography, dissect the works that marked his thought, such as The Law, or the famous Candlemaker's Petition, analyze his explosive political action during the Revolution of 1848, and finally, we will pierce the mystery of his erasure in France. Make yourself comfortable. We are heading to the 19th century to meet Frédéric Bastiat. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Roots of a Freethinker. The story of Frédéric Bastiat begins in the southwest of France. He was born on June 30th, 1801, in Bayonne, into a bourgeois family of merchants. Bayonne was then a flourishing port, and this geographic anchoring is crucial. Young Bastiat grew up in an environment oriented towards maritime trade and international commerce. But fate quickly struck. Bastiat lost his mother at 7, then his father in 1810. Orphaned at 9, he was taken in and raised by his paternal grandfather and his aunt Justine. He pursued brilliant studies, notably at the renowned College of Sorèze in the Tarn, where he forged a close friendship with Victor Calmette. It was with him that he developed an immoderate taste for the humanities, philosophy, and poetry. At 17, he left college without a degree to join his uncle's trading house in Bayonne. It is there, with his hands in the account ledgers, that he concretely observed the devastating effects of wars, blockades, and protectionism on the economy and people's lives. The asphyxiation of Bayonne's trade under the empire would mark him for life. In 1825, upon the death of his grandfather, Bastiat inherited the Sangrès estate in Mugron, in the Chalosse region. He thus became a country gentleman. He tried to apply modern agronomic methods to his lands, but it was a practical failure. He clashed with routine and his own disinterest in money. In reality, Bastiat was an intellectual. For 20 years, in the quiet of Mugron, he read, studied, and debated almost daily with his neighbor and great friend Félix Coudroy. Together, they devoured the works of Jean-Baptiste Say, Adam Smith, and especially Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer, through the journal Le Censeur Européen. These readings forged his liberal thought. Alongside this, Bastiat got involved locally. He became a justice of the peace for his canton in 1831 and was elected general councillor of the land in 1832. A wise, respected man, but one who remained in the shadows. Until 1844. That is when the spark occurred. One day, in his reading circle in Mugron, he stumbled upon English newspapers and discovered the existence of the Anti-Corn Law League, the Manchester League led by Richard Cobden. This British popular movement was fighting to abolish taxes on wheat imports in order to feed the poor. Fascinated, Bastiat decided he had to import this fight to France. In October 1844, he sent his first major article to the Journal des Economistes in Paris, on the influence of French and English tariffs on the future of the two peoples. The text dropped like a bombshell. The style was lively, the logic flawless. Overnight, the unknown 43-year-old provincial was invited to Paris, celebrated by the capital's great economists. It was the beginning of a meteoric career that would last only 6 years, but which would change the history of ideas. Chapter 2. The Pen and the Sword. The works that marked his thought. Upon his arrival in Paris, Bastiat threw himself wholeheartedly into the battle. He published a book in 1845, Cobden and the League, and became the General Secretary of the Free Trade Association, even creating the journal Le Libre-Échange, Free Trade, to spread his ideas. But where Bastiat was unique was in his method of communication. Faced with academic jargon and pompous theories, he used common sense, satire, and storytelling. This gave birth to his most famous work, The Economic Sophisms, published in 2 series in 1846 and 1848. What is a sophism for Bastiat? It is an economic argument that seems logical on the surface, but is fundamentally false and misleading, often used by an interest group to hide the fact that it is enriching itself at the expense of others. The absolute masterpiece of this collection is the famous Candlemaker's Petition. Listen closely to the absurdity of the reasoning that Bastiat ironically deploys. He imagines the manufacturers of candles, lamps and streetlights sending a petition to Parliament. They demand to be protected against the unfair competition of a formidable foreign rival, who floods the market with light at a price defying all competition. The sun. The petitioners therefore demand a law compelling the closing of all windows, skylights and shutters in France. The argument? If the sun is blocked, more candles will be consumed. Therefore, more tallow will be needed, hence more oxen, more sheep, more whales hunted for oil. In short, the entire economy will be stimulated. Through this masterful satire, Bastiat ridiculed protectionism. He proved that rejecting a foreign product just because it is cheaper amounts to rejecting a gift of nature. He recalled that the goal of the economy is the consumer and abundance, and not to create arduous labor for the sole profit of protected producers. In another equally striking text, Bastiat speaks of the negative railroad. Deputies proposed creating a break in the tracks on the railway at Bordeaux to force travelers and goods to stop. This would provide a living for local porters, boatmen, and hoteliers. Bastiat pushed the logic to its limit. If it is so good for Bordeaux, let's do it in Angoulême, in Poitiers, in Tours too. Let's make a railroad composed entirely of stops, a negative railroad. Here again, he demonstrated that sacrificing global efficiency for the benefit of a particular local interest is an economic absurdity. But his most powerful concept, the one that would influence modern economics up to the concept of opportunity cost, was published in 1850 in his essay, What is Seen and What is Not Seen. To illustrate it, Bastiat invented the broken window fallacy. Imagine a child who breaks the window of his father's shop, Jacques Bonhomme. The onlookers console themselves by saying, "It's an ill wind that blows nobody good. It keeps the glazier in business." The glazier comes, installs the window, and pockets 6 francs. That is what is seen. But Bastiat alerts us to what is not seen. If the window had not been broken, Jacques Bonhomme would have had 6 francs in his pocket. With this money, he could have bought shoes or a book. The shoemaker or the bookseller would have had 6 more francs. Because the window is broken, society as a whole has not gained any wealth. It has lost the equivalent of a window. Destruction is not profit. This principle applies to the action of the state. When the government taxes citizens to finance a large project or subsidize an industry, we see the jobs created by this project. But we do not see the jobs and wealth that could never come into being because the money was taken from the taxpayers' pockets. It is a lesson in absolute lucidity. Chapter 3. Political Action, the Law and Accomplishments. In February 1848, the revolution broke out. King Louis-Philippe was overthrown. The Second Republic was proclaimed. Despite his health beginning to seriously decline, Bastiat took to the streets, created revolutionary newspapers like Jacques Bonhomme with his friends, and was elected representative, deputy, of the Landes to the Constituent Assembly, then to the Legislative Assembly. In this hemicycle, Bastiat was a free spirit. He sat mostly on the left, but he refused party logic. He said it himself. He voted with the right to defend order against socialist delusions, and he voted with the left to defend liberty against the authoritarianism of the conservatives. For example, he voted for the abolition of the death penalty, for union rights and the freedom of association, but he voted against the national workshops, a public job creation program, and against excessive taxes. His expertise was such that he was appointed vice president of the Assembly's Finance Committee 8 times. Faced with the explosion of socialist ideas of the time, those of Louis Blanc, Proudhon, or Considérant, Bastiat published one of his most fundamental texts in 1850, The Law. In this masterful little book, he returned to the philosophy of natural law. For Bastiat, life, liberty, and property are natural rights prior to any legislation. The law is there only to guarantee the right of legitimate defense of these 3 elements. Well, Bastiat sounded an alarm. The law had been perverted. Instead of protecting property, the state uses it to organize what he calls legal plunder. When the law takes from some what belongs to them to give to others, it is no longer justice, it is legalized theft. And when this plunder becomes the system, he said, the beneficiaries create a moral code to justify it. He was deeply suspicious of this political constructivism, what he called artificial organization, where legislators consider the people as inert clay that they must mold according to their own vision of fraternity. For Bastiat, true fraternity is not decreed under the compulsion of the law. It must be free and voluntary. It was during this period that he engaged in a famous polemic with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the father of anarchism and socialist theorist. In the newspaper La Voix du Peuple, for 13 weeks, they debated the gratuitousness of credit and the legitimacy of interest. Proudhon characterized loans at interest as theft, as usury. Bastiat, on the other hand, demonstrated that capital is the fruit of savings, of a present sacrifice for the future, and that lending is a service that deserves remuneration, the rule of service for service. Faced with Bastiat's implacable logic, Proudhon lost his temper and ended up insulting him. Scientifically, Mr. Bastiat, you are a dead man. Yet, it was Bastiat who was literally dying. Afflicted by tuberculosis, his throat caused him terrible suffering, and he no longer even had the voice to speak at the Assembly's rostrum. In a final effort, coughing up blood, he wrote his great unfinished work, Economic Harmonies. Against the socialist idea of an inevitable class struggle,
Bastiat defended the theory that all legitimate human interests are harmonious. In a free market, capital accumulates, the price of things decreases, and the standard of living of all rises, bringing social classes closer together. In the fall of 1850, his doctors sent him to Italy, with the hope that the climate would cure him. But it was too late. On December 24, 1850, in Rome, Frédéric Bastiat breathed his last. On his deathbed, he murmured 2 words before passing away: the truth. He is buried at the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi.
Chapter 4. Posterity, Tributes and The Paradox of French Amnesia. Frédéric Bastiat's legacy is an absolutely fascinating paradox.
Let's start with his accomplishments and the tributes paid to him. Bastiat did not merely leave behind texts. He profoundly influenced the course of the global economy. The foundations he laid led, 10 years after his death, to the signing in 1860 of the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, a historic free trade agreement between France and Great Britain, concluded by his disciple Michel Chevalier.
On an academic level, his contribution is immense. Joseph Schumpeter said of him that there was no better economic journalist, even though he minimized his theoretical contribution. But major economists have corrected this injustice. Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek called him a publicist of genius, and often used his arguments. Better yet, Bastiat is today considered the precursor of the Austrian School of Economics. Figures of this school, such as Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, or Mark Thornton, see Bastiat as a pioneering theorist. Why? Because Bastiat defined economics not through mathematics, but through human action and deductive logic. He theorized subjective value, the idea that the value of a thing does not reside in the labor time it cost, but in the service rendered to the consumer. On the political side, his influence crossed the Atlantic and the Channel. US President Ronald Reagan cited him as one of his greatest economic inspirations. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, said of him, "By reading the work of Bastiat again, I discovered an elegant and powerful defense of freedom." Bastiat reminded us that the meaning of power goes from individuals upwards and not from the state downwards. It is a message for all times. In the United States, millions of copies of his book, The Law, have been sold, and think tanks as well as journalistic prizes bear his name today. But then comes the big question, the thorny question. Why is Frédéric Bastiat, this brilliant, clear, visionary thinker, recognized worldwide, virtually unknown in France, his native country, to such an extent that he is almost never taught in high schools, nor in economics or political science universities? Several reasons explain this French amnesia. 1. The hegemony of French statism and centralism. France has historically been built around a very strong state, from Colbertism under the monarchy to the Jacobinism of the Revolution, up to the post-war social model. Bastiat's ideas, which advocate anti-statism, absolute individual responsibility, and a minimal state, directly clash with the French social model. His concept of the state, perceived as a machine of legal plunder, is blasphemy for traditional French political culture. 2. Academic disdain for simplicity. In France, the intellectual world often values what is complex, abstract, sometimes jargon-heavy. Bastiat's style was crystal clear, humorous, written for the general public. Some academics, seeing his metaphors and fables, snubbed him, considering him a mere second-rate polemicist and refusing to see the praxeological depth of his theories. 3. The influence of Marxism and Keynesianism. After the Second World War, the French academic world was largely dominated by intellectual Marxism, and in economics, by state Keynesianism. Bastiat, a defender of savings, capital, free competition, and a fierce opponent of socialism, which he described as destructive and primitive, was conscientiously erased from memories and educational programs. Even his statue in Mugron suffered the ravages of time. Erected in 1878, thanks to a public subscription, It was destroyed in 1942 by the Nazi occupation to recover the bronze. It was remade after the war, but the figure of fame that accompanied it has disappeared forever, a tragic symbol. Today, rediscovering Frédéric Bastiat is like finding a 170-year-old intellectual antidote that is still incredibly effective against demagogic speeches. Whether it is justifying absurd subsidies, taxing to create jobs while destroying value elsewhere, or promising that the state can solve all problems without dipping into citizens' pockets, Bastiat had warned us. He leaves us a timeless lesson. In economics, one must never stop at what is visible at first glance. Good judgment consists in also analyzing what is not seen, the indirect effects, the lost opportunities, and the confiscated liberties. Frédéric Bastiat was neither a cold dogmatist nor a cynical financier. He was a passionate humanist who saw in the free market and voluntary exchange the only way to guarantee peace, the prosperity of the working classes, and above all, human dignity in the face of the violence of legal coercion.
Part 2. Alexis de Tocqueville.
We now delve into the life and mind of a man who, although coming from the oldest nobility in France, managed to become the greatest analyst and prophet of modern democracy. A man who, in the 19th century, described with almost frightening precision the societies in which we live today. That man is Alexis de Tocqueville.
Through this narrative, we will explore his biography, his major works, his political accomplishments, and also understand why this genius, praised in the United States, was ignored for so long, even forgotten, in his own country. Chapter 1. The Roots of an Aristocrat Facing Modernity. Alexis Charles-Henri Clérel, Count of Tocqueville, was born in Paris on July 29, 1805. He came from a family of very old Norman nobility. His family heritage was heavy, branded by history. His family, indeed, suffered the full brunt of the Revolutionary Terror. His great-grandfather was none other than Malesherbes, the illustrious lawyer of Louis XVI, guillotined in 1794. His parents themselves narrowly escaped the scaffold, saved by the fall of Robespierre. It is in this legitimist environment, bruised but proud, that young Alexis grew up. However, very early on, he detached himself from the illusions of his caste. After brilliant law studies, he obtained his degree and became an auditor judge at the Versailles court in 1827. It was there that he made a decisive encounter, that of Gustave de Beaumont, a young substitute who would become his most intimate friend and lifelong collaborator. In 1830, the July Revolution broke out. The legitimate Bourbon monarchy fell, replaced by that of Louis-Philippe. For Tocqueville, it was a moral heartbreak. Although a legitimist at heart, he understood that the movement towards equality was inevitable. Out of political realism, he took an oath to the new regime on August 16, 1830, an act he performed with profound bitterness and which his family experienced as a betrayal. Feeling stuck in his career and stifled by the Parisian political climate, he looked for a way out. With his friend Beaumont, he requested and obtained a mission from the Ministry of the Interior to travel to the United States to study the American penitentiary system. On April 2, 1831, the two friends embarked on a journey that would last nearly 10 months, but if the official pretext was the study of prisons, from which they would incidentally draw a report rewarded by the Académie Française in 1833, Tocqueville's true goal was much vaster. He went to America to observe the future. He wanted to understand what he considered the best available example of democracy. Chapter 2. The American Laboratory and the Dissection of Democracy, Thoughts and Works. From this trip, Tocqueville brought back the material for what would become one of the greatest masterpieces of political philosophy, Democracy in America, the first volume of which was published in 1835, followed by the second in 1840. The success was immediate and resounding, propelling Tocqueville to the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences, and then to the Académie Française at only 36 years old. But what exactly is the main thesis of this work? For Tocqueville, the inevitable engine of modern history is what he calls the equalization of conditions. This is not a perfect economic equality, but a social state. There are no more castes, no more rigid hereditary hierarchies, and all individuals have, in principle, the same rights and the same chances. Democracy for Tocqueville is above all a state of society before being a form of government. However, and herein lies Tocqueville's genius, he does not settle for blind praise. He is an anxious observer. He theorizes the perpetual tension between equality and liberty. He understands that democratic peoples have an ardent, insatiable, eternal, invincible passion for equality. He even writes, in a striking manner, "There is indeed a manly and legitimate passion for equality, which incites men to want all to be strong and esteemed. But there is also to be found in the human heart a depraved taste for equality, which impels the weak to want to bring the strong down to their level, and which reduces men to preferring equality in servitude to inequality in freedom. This obsessive quest for equality carries within it mortal dangers for freedom." Tocqueville identifies mainly three. The first is the tyranny of the majority. In a society where all opinions are of equal value, number becomes the sole rule of truth. The majority can impose its views in a despotic manner, marginalizing any dissenting thought and establishing a stifling conformism. The second great peril is individualism. Tocqueville gives this word a new meaning. It is not classic egoism, but, I quote him, "a reflective and peaceable sentiment which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and to withdraw into the circle of family and friends. With this little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself." By withdrawing into his private sphere, family and friends, the democratic citizen loses interest in public affairs. And this is where the third peril comes in, the most terrifying, which Tocqueville calls soft despotism. Since citizens isolate themselves, the state rushes into the void. An immense and tutelary central power takes charge of the lives of individuals to ensure their comfort. This power, says Tocqueville, does not break men's wills, but softens, bends, and guides them. It transforms the nation into a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. But Tocqueville is not fatalistic. He observes in the United States the antidotes to these evils: administrative decentralization, judicial power, but above all freedom of association and intermediary bodies, which force individuals to step out of their isolation to collaborate. He also highlights the fundamental role of religion as a moral brake on purely materialistic passion. Chapter 3. The Man of Action, the Politician and His Disillusionments. Tocqueville, as we have seen, is a thinker of genius, but he also has the ambition for action. As he himself would say, with disarming lucidity, "I am worth more in thought than in action," yet he threw himself into politics. In 1839, he was elected deputy for Valognes, in the Manche, the region where his family castle is located, and he retained this seat until the coup d'état of 1851. In the chamber, he positioned himself on the center-left. He was not a peerless orator. His speech was elegant and substantial, but sometimes judged too theoretical. Nevertheless, his parliamentary work was rigorous. He defended anti-slavery positions, spoke out in favor of free trade, and wrote reports on prison reform and the colonization of Algeria. He was above all one of the few to perceive the seismic fault lines of the July monarchy. On January 27, 1848, from the tribune of the Assembly, he delivered a prophetic speech that froze the audience. While everything seemed calm, he declared, "Do you not feel, by some intuitive instinct which is not capable of analysis, but which is certain, that the earth is quaking once again in Europe? Do you not feel a gale of revolution in the air? I believe that we are at this moment sleeping on a volcano. I am profoundly convinced of it." A few weeks later, the February Revolution of 1848 broke out, sweeping away the monarchy and establishing the Second Republic. Tocqueville, although not a Republican at heart, rallied to it out of duty. He was elected to the Constituent Assembly by universal suffrage. He joined the commission charged with drafting the new constitution. There, he waged a fierce battle against socialist ideas. He fiercely opposed the inclusion of the right to work, believing that this would transform the state into an absolute entrepreneur, the premise, according to him, of a communism that would destroy individual liberty. In June 1849, he accepted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs under the presidency of Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte. For 5 months, he tried to maintain France's voice in a boiling Europe. But Tocqueville detested the authoritarian maneuvers of Louis-Napoleon. When the latter fomented his coup d'état on December 2, 1851, Tocqueville was among the deputies who gathered to vote for the deposition of the prince-president. He was arrested, briefly incarcerated at the Château de Vincennes, then released. This was the end of his public political life. True to his principles, refusing to serve a despot, he retired. Chapter 4. The Return to History and Private Life. Rejected from political action, Tocqueville returned to his archives and his desk. In this withdrawal, he found the unfailing support of his wife, Mary Motley. Tocqueville had married this middle-class Englishwoman in 1835. It was a love marriage, against the advice of his aristocratic family who had hoped for a prestigious match. Mary was not only a devoted companion, fluent in several languages, she was his first reader, his critic, and a true daily intellectual collaborator. It was in this retreat, already fighting the tuberculosis that was consuming him, that he first wrote his Recollections, Souvenirs, a masterpiece of political psychology that would only be published after his death. So fierce and uncompromising were the portraits he painted of his contemporaries. Then, in 1856, he published his second great work, The Old Regime and the Revolution. His thesis there was revolutionary. Contrary to popular belief, the French Revolution did not create a new world out of nothing. It merely completed, in a violent manner, a long process of administrative centralization and equalization of conditions that had been initiated under the old regime by the kings themselves. The Jacobin and then Napoleonic state simply took over from the monarchical state, perfecting the crushing of local liberties in favor of an all-powerful central power. Tocqueville died on April 16, 1859 in Cannes at the age of 53, leaving the second part of this masterful work unfinished. Chapter 5. The explanation of the oblivion and the rediscovery. We have now reached an essential question. How could a thinker of such stature, recognized in the United States and England during his lifetime, experience such a long period in the wilderness in his own country, France? The explanation lies largely in the unclassifiable nature of the man and the very structure of the French intellectual landscape. Tocqueville belonged to no faction. He confessed it himself in a famous personal note from 1841. I have an intellectual inclination for democratic institutions, but I am an aristocrat by instinct. That is to say, I despise and fear the crowd. I passionately love liberty, legality, the respect for rights, but not democracy. This is the depths of my soul. Liberty is my foremost passion. That is the truth. This aristocratic liberalism, this posture of an engaged spectator, made him inaudible in a 19th and early 20th century France torn between two irreconcilable blocs. On one side, conservatives and reactionaries who rejected the revolution and dreamed of a return to the old order. On the other, socialists and romantic revolutionaries for whom real equality and class struggle were the only horizons. Tocqueville, who accepted social democracy as an inevitability while castigating the tyranny of the central state, was too democratic for the right of his time and far too liberal and anti-totalitarian for the nascent Marxist left. Moreover, his writing style, which was lucid, cold, and analytical, lacked the lyrical passion of a Victor Hugo or the fervor of a Karl Marx. He told the unvarnished truth without promising a utopia. It took until the mid-20th century, notably the 1950s, for Tocqueville's work to be truly rediscovered in France. This resurrection is largely due to the philosopher and sociologist Raymond Aron. At the height of the Cold War, facing the rise of Soviet totalitarianism and the hegemony of Marxism among French intellectuals, Aron seized upon Tocqueville to build a liberal political sociology. Aron showed that Tocqueville had seen correctly. It is not the contradictions of capitalism that are the key to modernity, but rather this tension between the passion for equality and the preservation of liberties. Following Aron, historians like François Furet would rely on Tocqueville to rethink the French Revolution outside the prism of class struggle. In the United States, contemporary sociologists like Richard Sennett or Robert Putnam still draw inspiration from him to analyze the withdrawal into oneself and the dissolution of civic bonds in modern man. Part 3. The Crossroads of Geniuses and the Legacy. Chapter 1. The Ultimate Battlefield, 1848 and the Fight Against the Illusion. To truly grasp the parallel genius of Frédéric Bastiat and Alexis de Tocqueville, we must visualize them in the exact same room, at the exact same moment. The year is 1848. The July monarchy has collapsed, swept away by the February Revolution. The National Assembly is boiling with revolutionary fervor. Both Tocqueville and Bastiat are elected representatives, sitting on the very same benches, breathing the same tense air, and watching the rise of a new, seductive, and dangerous ideology, state socialism. Tocqueville had seen it coming. Weeks before the revolution, on January 27, 1848, he took to the parliamentary rostrum and delivered a speech that froze his colleagues.
Looking at the degradation of public morality and the growing social unrest, he warned them, "I believe that we are at this moment sleeping on a volcano. Do you not feel a gale of revolution in the air?" His warning was ignored, but history soon proved him right. When the Bloody June Days uprising erupted a few months later, pitting over 100,000 armed workers against the government, Tocqueville did not see it as a mere political riot. He diagnosed it as a servile war, a brutal class combat born from a mixture of greed and false theories that depicted the wealth of the rich as a theft practiced upon the poor. The great debate of the hour in the Assembly was the right to work, le droit au travail. Socialist thinkers like Louis Blanc demanded that the new constitution guarantee employment for every citizen, effectively forcing the government to provide jobs through national workshops. Both of our protagonists recognized this as a fatal trap. Tocqueville, serving on the Constitutional Commission, waged a fierce battle against this concept. He argued that if the state becomes the universal employer, it must inevitably become the absolute master of all industry, all capital, and all property. He reminded the Assembly that the original French Revolution was fought for liberty, not for a system that would transform the state into an absolute entrepreneur. The premise, he argued, of a communism that would destroy individual freedom. At the exact same time, from the exact same benches, Bastiat was attacking the same socialist illusion with his sharp economic pen. In his masterful 1850 essay, The Law, Bastiat diagnosed the very mechanism of this socialist dream. He called it legal plunder. Bastiat explained that the state produces no wealth of its own. It cannot give to one citizen without first confiscating it from another through taxes or coercion. Bastiat denounced the political constructivism of his socialist peers, who viewed society as inert clay to be molded by the government. In a famous and relentless 13-week debate in the press, Bastiat absolutely demolished the arguments of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the father of anarchism, proving that capital is the fruit of savings and present sacrifice, and that lending is a service that deserves remuneration. Proudhon, out of arguments, ended up insulting him. Scientifically, Mr. Bastiat, you are a dead man. Together, the aristocrat sociologist and the bourgeois economist fought back to back. Tocqueville foresaw the psychological degradation, the soft despotism, where citizens surrender their autonomy and become a flock of timid animals, guided by an omnipresent government. Bastiat proved the economic absurdity of it, the unseen destruction of wealth caused by excessive taxation and regulation. They both realized that the ultimate victim of the expanding welfare state was not just the economy, but the moral character, dignity, and independence of the citizen. Their political fight, however, was cut short by tragedy. Afflicted by tuberculosis, Bastiat's throat caused him such terrible suffering that he could no longer speak at the Assembly's rostrum. He died in Rome in December 1850, whispering the word truth on his deathbed. Tocqueville, who fiercely opposed Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte's authoritarian coup d'etat in 1851, was briefly imprisoned and forced to retire from public life, spending his final years writing his historical masterpiece, The Old Regime and the Revolution, before he too succumbed to tuberculosis in 1859. Chapter 2. The Antidote for the 21st Century. As we look at our world today, the relevance of their combined genius is staggering. We are no longer dealing with prophecies, we are living in the exact future they dreaded. Look at our modern democracies, heavily burdened by astronomical public debts, sprawling bureaucracies, and endless regulations. When politicians today promise universal subsidies, free services, and guaranteed outcomes, without explaining how to finance them, we are living precisely in Bastiat's great fiction. Every time we measure the success of a government by the sheer volume of public spending, what is seen, we are ignoring Bastiat's golden rule. We are deliberately turning a blind eye to the businesses that will never be created, the innovations that are stifled, and the purchasing power confiscated through inflation and taxation, what is not seen. And when we look at our social fabric, the rise of loneliness, the decline of community associations, and the modern reflex to demand that the central government solve every minor local dispute or personal grievance, we are witnessing Tocqueville's soft despotism in full action. The state has indeed become the benevolent shepherd of a docile flock, regulating our lives from cradle to grave, stripping us of the trouble of thinking and the pain of living. Yet, the ultimate message of Bastiat and Tocqueville is not one of fatalism or despair. It is a fierce call to intellectual courage and civic awakening. They teach us that civil society must be defended at all costs. Bastiat reminds us that true solidarity is not a tax extracted by force. It is the natural result of free, voluntary human exchange and mutual aid. Tocqueville reminds us that freedom is a muscle that atrophies if left unused. It must be exercised daily through local associations, a vibrant free press, and individual responsibility. In an era tempted by the easy, loud answers of populism on one side, and the cold, administrative grip of technocracy on the other, Frédéric Bastiat and Alexis de Tocqueville offer us the most precious gift of all. They offer us the clarity to see through political illusions and the moral strength to reclaim our destiny.
Conclusion. Today, the work of Alexis de Tocqueville resonates with unsettling force. At a time when Western democracies are torn by populisms, when individualism has never been stronger, and when the temptation to rely on sprawling states is growing, rereading Tocqueville is a necessity. He reminds us that democracy is not a definitive achievement, but a fragile balance. It only survives through the engagement of its citizens, the strength of associations, and the jealous preservation of individual liberties against tyranny. Whether it be that of a despot or that of a self-righteous majority. Closing this vast chapter dedicated to Alexis de Tocqueville and Frédéric Bastiat, one thing becomes obvious. The French 19th century gave birth to two of the greatest prophets of modern liberty. Through different prisms, political sociology for one, political economy for the other, they arrived at exactly the same conclusions. They understood, before anyone else, that a society cannot prosper if it sacrifices individual responsibility on the altar of an equality imposed by the state. Bastiat taught us to look at what is not seen behind every political promise, while Tocqueville urged us never to trade our freedom for the comfort of a benevolent servitude, forgotten for a time by a France often torn between its authoritarian temptations and its revolutionary dreams. Today, they are our most precious compass. Their works, read all over the world, remind us that freedom is never definitively acquired. It is a fragile heritage that demands the courage of truth and the engagement of every citizen. Thank you for accompanying us on this great intellectual journey. See you very soon for a new episode.